Greetings, friend, and welcome to the Between the Covers podcast, where we are working every day to remove the self-limiting beliefs that are preventing us from becoming the heroes of our own stories. I am Marcus Spar, and today I hope to wrap up the telling of my story thus far. Before we get into it, I do want to remind you that if you have any questions or if you have ideas for individuals that we could study for hero study episodes, feel free to submit those on my website on my podcast page. We've made it through some of the darkest years of my life at this point. And I specifically am titling this one Growing Up because there is so much that has taken place since my early to mid-20s that have had a profound impact on my maturity and how I have grown as an individual. After graduating from college, I returned back here to my mom's home, and I was living with her for about a year or so while I was trying to find a job as an educator. This was something that never actually did happen. I applied for many positions, and as soon as positions would open up and you have all of these teachers within the districts that are vying for these different positions, inevitably what happened is I would take a look at what there was after the dust settled, and after not even receiving interviews for any of the jobs that I applied for, and the jobs that were left were those that I was woefully unqualified for. We're talking bilingual and special education, which were not endorsements that I got in my degree. In fact, I found out with a much larger Hispanic and migrant population here in southeastern Washington, we have a lot of vineyards and orchards and agricultural farms that oftentimes need some help with their harvests and with planting and all that stuff. What I had decided to go for in college, being specifically elementary education and teaching English as a second language, if I had moved to the much more expensive west side of Washington State, I would have been much more marketable. And that was something I wasn't very willing to do. I would not have been able to survive on my own up there. So I worked as a substitute teacher. I did this for 7 years. And there were times where I would take a break from subbing because I was so fed up with that as a job that I would work some retail positions. I worked for GameStop, I worked for Staples, I just did whatever I could. I even had a job at an Amazon call center for a while. It was a really challenging time. However, within that first year or two after graduating from high school, I was still trying to find love. And while I was looking for this, I had this young lady in Florida who we had a desire to be closer to each other. Of course, unless I lived in Alaska, we couldn't be any further apart than Washington and Florida. And I tried to get some kind of job as a teacher over in Florida so I could move over there. And it would have been a very big step for me, moving that far away from my family and all of my support. And yet it didn't happen. This relationship just remained online and long distance for a good long while. And eventually we decided, you know what, this is something that we're not going to pursue anymore. It's just not working. I was crestfallen, to say the least. And I was 24, 25 at this time, and made the absolutely asinine decision that none of this was going to work. I was never going to find love. And so I would just resign myself to being single the rest of my life. It wasn't worth the heartache. It wasn't worth the effort. And, you know, when you're in those more depressed states of mind, we always make the best decisions. So it was around this time that my best friend from the first grade is getting married. And I was asked to be one of the groomsmen. And during this time, my mom was reminding me that it's oftentimes at your friends' weddings that you meet your future spouse, and I just didn't want any of it. I wasn't going to have any of it. I was done. I'm like, you know, I will just go. I'm going to support my friend Kyle, and I am intentionally going to not dance to any slow dances because that would require me to have a partner or have the desire to have a partner and try and meet someone, and I just wasn't going to do that. We go to Yakima, and we have the rehearsal, do the rehearsal dinner. This was on Halloween, and so a lot of us were dressed up. I was dressed up as Master Chief from the Halo series, even had the plastic helmet that I wore over my head unless I was eating or legitimately trying to have a conversation with someone. And it was during this that I was very near the individual who would become my partner, Libby. Neither one of us knew each other, and we did not even really recognize or notice each other because we were in costume. She was dressed up as Sora from the Kingdom Hearts franchise, and me wearing this armor as the Spartan and everything. It just, yeah, we were around each other, but we didn't actually notice each other. And one of the things that I will often share is my friend Kyle and his wife Connie, when they were together and they attended Washington State University, there was this one individual, a part of their friend group, named Libby, who they wanted to try and find someone that she would be compatible with. And as they were talking about it this one time, my friend Kyle is like, you know, I have this friend Marcus, but they didn't want to introduce us to each other because she was in Pullman and I was in Ellensburg at the time. They didn't know how that distance was going to work out, so they are like, you know what, we think that they would be good with each other, but we don't want to bring that up because we don't know how that distance is going to work out. So I was very close to Libby when we were at this rehearsal dinner. We have the wedding. It was beautiful. The reception that followed, and I was sticking to my guns. I was only going to dance in the more upbeat songs with groups, and I was going to sit down when there was a slow song because I wasn't going to slow dance with anyone. And I was having a great time. And being one of the groomsmen, I had found out without knowing that with that commitment, I was pretty much expected to be there until the last song was played in order to support the husband and groom, or husband and wife. And I'm like, you know what? I'm willing to do that. Yeah, I'm willing to do that. It's a great honor to be a part of the bridal party and be able to support my friends. And during all of this, Libby and I have been dancing in some of the same groups. Again, without really knowing it. And the DJ comes on and says, this is the last song of the night, so come on up here and support the bride and groom. And he starts playing a slow song. And I'm like, damn it. I really do not want to dance to a slow song. And yet I was still in the mood to dance. I guess this is one of those tales about, be careful what you wish for and how often things don't actually go according to plan. I was dancing with this young lady who is a friend of Libby's and a friend of a lot of people in her friend group from college. And we just got done with this dance, and I hear the announcement, it's the last dance, or the last song. And I look around for this young lady, and she was nowhere to be found. So I just kind of look around, and I look down, and there is another young lady who is sitting on a chair at the edge of the dance floor, and I just extend my hand to her and say, would you like to dance? And she was like, yeah, absolutely. And that was when I officially met Libby. So we got to know each other while we were dancing. And I find it so amusing that when she was telling me what she was studying in college, I completely misheard it. I thought she was going into aeroscience, but she was actually going through neuroscience. So really different fields there. But we get done dancing, and I'm able to say bye to my friend and his new wife. And my mom and I drove to Yakima together, and we were going to drive back. And this is one of the things where my partner Libby, though we've both been going through a faith deconstruction and reconstruction, she still considers herself a Christian. She doesn't consider herself an American Christian. And that's because there are certain things, kind of like my story with like that spirit of death that I shared in the last episode. There are certain things that she just can't set aside without having some kind of explanation of God or something more spiritual or ethereal taking place. And this was actually one of those moments where she heard a voice that said, "Don't let this man go." And I laugh when I think about it because she lost track of me. And that's because nature was calling. I was getting ready to head back home. I really had to pee. So I go use the facilities, and while I am washing up, it came to my mind of, I think I'd like to keep in touch with that gal that I was dancing with at the end. So I go back and I track her down, and we exchange information to keep in touch via social media. And we start messaging each other back and forth during this entire process. And after a while, so actually not even after a while, it's just like a couple of weeks really, because they got married in early November, and Libby was going to drive from Pullman to visit her parents. And it was a long drive. And the city that we actually live in now was kind of the halfway point for her. She would always stop off here to get gas and grab a bite to eat. And so she ended up messaging me and was like, hey, I'm going to be coming down to, or I'm going to be going for Thanksgiving to see my family, and I would like to stop off and spend, a couple hours as just this halfway point. I'd like to see you again. And that's when in my mind I'm like, oh, there's something different here. Considering I felt like I had to essentially beg my family to come to my graduation. Here's someone who was wanting to stop by in the middle of a long road trip and spend a couple of hours. And so that's when hope was rekindled in my heart. And I love telling this story because the day comes for her to drop by, and I open the door and there's Libby, and she has a man with her, and my heart sunk in that moment. We still had a good time. I took them to my favorite Chinese restaurant here. We played some Star Wars Battlefront on my Xbox, and it was a really good time. And when we were having lunch, I was trying to suss out whether these two were in a relationship with each other without trying to come outright and say, hey, are you guys in a relationship? And I never did get a straight answer on that. And eventually, at some point, her friend has to go use the bathroom before they leave, and I'm like, okay, it's just the two of us. I really want to find out, but I'm trying to talk and code and everything, and I just never got the answer I was looking for. And when I was sharing this story, Libby just started laughing, and she's like, it would have been so much easier had I told you he was gay. Because the person she was riding back home with was her gay best friend from high school. And had I known, that definitely would have saved me some questions and some heartache. And apparently the entire time that they were driving back, she talked about me all the time. And when Thanksgiving was done and she was on her way back, she's like, I want to stop off and see you again. This rekindled that hope once more, even though part of me was wanting to stamp it down as much as possible. But this time she was by herself because her friend wanted to stay longer with his family, and he was going to get a ride up with some others that lived in the area. And that's when I'm like, there's something different about this individual. And it's something that I really wanted to clue into. Because one of the things that I have come to expect is most people aren't going to show that kind of an interest in me. Most people aren't going to go out of their way to come visit me. Most people are not going to take the time and effort to show that desire. I'm the one who has to take those steps. I'm the one who has to go out of my way. I'm the one who has to drive several hours to see others. I'm the one who has to show that initiative. So here is someone who is showing that initiative, and I really clued into it. At some point, I go up to return the favor. I drive like 4 hours or so, 3-4 hours to go to WSU. And I spend a weekend with Libby in her apartment. And we had a great time. She introduced me to Rock Band, which is actually a game that her brother has worked on. And I introduced her to some of my favorite comedians that I just brought on DVD, and we had a great time. I spent money I probably shouldn't have spent because I went home with my own set of Rock Band. And yet I have not regretted that decision because it was an incredible bonding experience for us. And I was trying to admit to her over the entire weekend that I had feelings for her. And yet I had been hurt so many times in the past that I really struggled to do so. This was probably one of the hardest things for me to do. It's always hard for me to admit that I have loved someone because I've usually been heartbroken whenever that happens. And so, in typical male fashion, I wait until like the very last moment. I am loading up my little 89 Ford Ranger, and I've got my suitcase and everything's loaded up. Libby is standing there on the curb, and we give each other a hug, and it's at that moment that I don't tell her that I love her, because that was too much for me to say in that moment. But I summon up the courage to say, I'm falling in love with you. And needless to say, I didn't get the response that I was hoping for. And I remember driving back home feeling very depressed because she just kind of gave me this blank look after I had said that. And I drive away thinking, well, there's another friendship relationship that has been ruined because I assume there was something there that wasn't. And by the time I get home and I fire up my computer, I receive a relationship request on Facebook from her. And my heart leapt when that happened. In fact, I remember going on YouTube and pulling up I Think I'm Paranoid by Garbage and listening to that while the volume was cranked up because that was one of Libby's favorite songs that we played on Rock Band. And that is when Libby and I officially started dating. And it was a whirlwind of a time. Her brother ended up getting married. And then a year after that, Libby and I got married. And there is a joke from her parents that they had their kids like 6 years apart for a reason, so that they would have time to recoup from one wedding before they had to pay for another one, and that's not exactly how it turned out. Libby and I married. We dated for a year, and then we married, and we moved into our own apartment together. And this is where, in some previous episodes, I've shared that within the first month of our marriage, I almost destroyed it. Because I was one of those fools who believed that the reason why I was turning to pornography was because it was all about sex. And as soon as I was married and with the Christian values that I held at the time, that you have to save yourself for marriage, that as soon as I had someone and I had a wife and I had someone I could have sex with, that the porn issue would be gone. And that wasn't the case. And that destroyed her. She felt so betrayed from that. And this was one of the big steps for me in actually growing up. I would say the first step in me growing up was moving out on my own and still attending college. That was a big growing up step for me. And yet that did not compete with marriage. In fact, I remember hearing, it was my Uncle Larry he officiated our wedding and he did our premarital counseling with us. And one of the things that he had said is that marriage is not going to be the happily ever after that most people expect it to be. It's actually a tool that God uses to really grow us up. And in a lot of ways, that has been true. Libby married into my debt, and that was something that she really wrestled with. She never had any debt until she married me. And now she has inherited that. We have to figure out how to handle it. And let's just say early on, it was a lot of growing pains about how to financially handle our relationship, our desires, our impulses. And I grew up a lot. I grew up a lot during this time. I was still a substitute teacher, still trying to find my own classroom, still trying to get a full-time job, trying to get a salary, and it never happened. It was during this time, as I said earlier, that I would get burned out from substitute teaching, and then I'd start working retail. Then, there was this one time when I was working at GameStop, I started moving up the management ladder, and I was essentially the second assistant at the store that I worked at. And my boss was a high school friend of mine, and he was pretty determined to keep me moving and eventually managing my own store. But it created some conflict in mine and Libby's marriage because she would work during the day and I would work a lot at night and on weekends. So there were a lot of times that we were just like ships passing each other. And at one point, I will never forget this. At one point, I had the day off, and Libby was excited to finally have an evening together. It had been months since we were able to have some time together, because typically, if I wasn't working one day, there was about an 80% chance I was going to be called in to cover for someone else. And we were making plans of having a nice dinner, of watching a movie and playing some games together. And an hour before she gets home, I get a call saying, "I need you to come in." And I knew that this was going to ruin Libby's night. And when she comes in the door, I say, "Sweetheart, I'm sorry, but I was called into work." And she grabbed her phone, or her phone was in her hand, and she chucks it across the living room. And once that happened, I'm like, I really need to reconsider some things here. That's when I decided to step away and quit from working that job. And I tried going back into substitute teaching, and I woke up every morning dreading going into work. It did pay better, but it came at a much higher emotional and mental cost. I'd also had some bad experiences. I tried to use my writing and my desire to be a published author as a bargaining chip a lot of the time with the classes that I would sub in. I would share about what I was working on and let them ask questions, but it was a chip to say, if you guys behave, then I am happy to talk with you guys about this kind of stuff. And there were some schools and even some districts that were not happy with that. Some of it has to do with, again, this is a very conservative area in Washington, and I have a tendency to write about some darker things. And so I had some very interesting and hard conversations about some of my behavior. Again, big growing up experience. And realizing that this just wasn't going to work for me anymore. At this point, I had walked away from 2 different school districts around here, and there was only one district that I was still working in. And I did have some schools and some classes that loved to have me come in as a sub, and yet I needed to move on to something else. Then I start to apply for all these jobs, and I'm getting interviews. I'm even getting second interviews. I am pulling all the strings that I can to get someone to help me get a job so I could just be done working for the schools. And nothing worked. I had family friends helping me. I had even some church members of the previous church that I attended who were helping, and even on some of these interview groups or panels, I guess. And I was striking out. I remember applying for one job at a bank, and a small group member of mine and a friend at my previous church who was on the panel for the interview had said that I was in the top 3, but they ultimately chose someone else. And I'm like, well, it's nice to know that I'm like first or second loser in this whole thing. And it was so rough. It was so rough. And all the while, I'm still, on days I'm not working, I'm applying for jobs. I am still getting called very early in the morning or trying to grab as many subbing jobs as I can stomach just to help make ends meet. And eventually, Libby, at this point, she worked through a temp agency. Oh yeah, that's something else. I even worked with a couple of temp agencies. And I barely got any work for that because apparently I was too good. I remember getting one job. I was a temp for Manpower, and they got me a job. I went to this architectural firm, and I had to take these handwritten checklists and turn them into spreadsheets so they could easily print these off, do check marks and everything for these kind of jobs. And they're like, this is something that's probably going to take about 3 days to do, and I finish it in 1 day. Now, they didn't really want my help a whole lot because I actually did not make them a lot of money. Something that was going to give them money for 3 days, and they only got it for 1. So much for my work ethic being a boon in that society. But during this time, Libby had found a job where she was working as a temporary employee through a temp agency. And eventually a position opens up, and it was part-time at the same place. So she was working part-time for the temp agency, part-time for the company, and she was running their print shop while she was, as a temp, helping them wrangle data. And then it eventually becomes a full-time job. During this time, during this really difficult season of trying to find stable work, Libby was needing some help in the print shop. So I would come in and visit at times and talk with Libby, and I was getting to know some of her coworkers. And her boss, Joshua, says, hey, I know that Marcus is looking for some work. I know it's not much, but what if he came and just helped you out for 2 weeks? And as soon as I found that out, it's like, yes, let me do this. And I start commuting with my partner. We start working at the same place. I'm just a contracted employee helping her with some big production projects. And it was only going to be for 2 weeks. After the first week, Joshua would come in and say, I think we're going to keep doing this for another 2 weeks because there was just that much work that was coming in. After 2 weeks, we'll keep going for another week. And a job that was supposed to only go for 2 weeks went on for 6 months. And it got to the point where Joshua stopped telling me that he was going to he's going to have me keep coming back for another week. And I just kept showing up and I kept helping. And eventually, Libby moved on to a different department. Her position opened up. I applied for it, and Joshua was like, yep, you have a lot of experience with this. We're just going to hire you. And I finally got that full-time job that got me away from substitute teaching. And I worked at this organization for 5 years. And it was during this time that I actually started finding some resources that were helping me with my struggles with pornography. I had tried to work with a therapist, and that didn't really help. This is kind of a cautionary tale. When you're looking for a therapist, make sure you are finding someone who specializes in what it is that you need help with. I worked with a therapist who didn't specialize with pornography and the impacts that can have. And it was something that wasn't helpful. I started to really make some grounds in my own recovery and my own maturing during this, because a big part of my story is I struggled with this unwanted use of pornography for 2 decades. It was literally 20 years before I finally started to get some kind of foundation in what was really going on. And I was using it to run away from bad feelings, bad experiences, and a lot of discomfort. I grew up a lot during this time. I started discovering a lot of the memories and experiences I had growing up that were driving me to this unwanted behavior. It was feelings of being unwanted, undesired, of feeling useless, of feeling like I was of no value and I had no voice. Things that I have talked about in previous episodes. And some of these things I still wrestle with today. And yet, through all of this hardship, through financial ups and downs, through anxiety, that we had times where anxiety and fear was just overwhelming. Libby and I have been able to become very stable where we are. We are in a beautiful home that we are able to get thanks to my mom and her late husband, who bought this place, wanted to turn it into a rental property or just flip it and sell it. And eventually my twin brother was living in this house, and then he and his family decided to move to a bigger home, and my mom was like, hey, what would you think about becoming neighbors? And we're like, you know what? That actually sounds pretty nice. Being closer to where we go shopping, closer to family. That sounds like a good thing. And so we moved into this home, and we have had still ups and downs. We navigated the COVID pandemic here. We were both essential employees because the company we worked for was an agricultural company, and it was very much a needed industry during that time. And so we were fortunate that we never lost any work. And yet there was also a ton of anxiety and fear around getting sick, about who was not following some of the suggestions or even mandates about wearing masks and staying home when you're sick. It was a tumultuous time, to say the least. And yet, it was also in 2018 that I would meet some individuals who would become my core group of friends right now. In fact, my friend Kai, who I interviewed for my hero study of Taylor Swift, it was her and her brothers who invited me to join this group that was meeting at a pet salon for learning how to play Dungeons and Dragons, because one of their youth leaders loved playing Dungeons and Dragons, and they're like, we want to learn. It seems like it'd be something that you'd really enjoy doing. And I'm like, sure, why not? I grew up somewhat during the satanic panic of the 1980s and 1990s, and I never did get into D&D because one of the things I heard was it was demonic, it was evil. Ugh, way off from the truth. It is a great way to work with others to tell a really awesome story. So I show up to this pet salon. I've never been to this place before, and I know like 3 of the people there because they were essentially like my adopted nibblings. We were friends with their parents, and we lived in the same city for a while, attended the same church. And they were teenagers at the time. They loved Libby and I. And we would come over a lot for barbecues. I would have the kids come over and we'd play some games. We were kind of like an aunt and uncle to these individuals. And that is where I met Ben and Katie. And then after a while, I met Brandon. And then there was this one time, I remember we had broken off into 4 different tables at this time because the group had just grown and grown. And it was getting to be too much for Ben to be able to run a game. And it was after the 3rd session, I believe, that we had been playing, that Ben pulls me aside and he's like, "Hey, Marcus, you seem to have a pretty good grasp of the rules of this game. What would you think about running your own table?" And talk about a vote of confidence, and also something that instilled so much fear and insecurity in me, because in my mind, I'm like, I barely understand the rules of this game. Sure, let's go ahead and I will run my own table. And so I start running one of the games. And I remember this one day, we were setting up, or maybe we were even in the middle of playing, but all of a sudden someone comes over and he is a friend of Ben's, and Ben gets so excited. He's like, "John!" And I was like, I don't know what it is about this John person that Ben is so fond of. And I got to meet John, and John has become a great friend of mine now. And then during the pandemic, we started playing D&D online. We created a different group, and it was through this that I got to meet Dan. And I was a part of this group for at least a year, just by myself. And I remember there were times I would come home at like midnight or later. Libby was already in bed, and I was so wound from the adventure that we were playing through that I would come home, change into my PJs, and Libby would still be awake, and then I would lie in bed with her, and I would just vomit on her about all of the stuff that we got into, the funny things that happened, and I was just sharing all of this stuff from D&D with these people. And I kept telling her, they keep saying, if you want to join, there is a seat for you. They'd love to have you there. And eventually Libby's like, you know what? Yeah, I think I will do that. And I'm so glad that she did, because for years she had her college friends. And then once they all graduated, they all were on the west side, or they moved to a different state. And at this point, Libby and I, we'd been married almost 10 years. And I was really like her only friend. She tried to connect with our sisters-in-law, and it was a struggle. And so she joined our group, and now she has these awesome, awesome people that we would not have made it through 2023 without them. I wouldn't have made it here where I am today without them. These people have become the best friends that I have had in a long time. And I look forward to spending time with them. I have grown up a lot. I have matured a lot through the 14 years Libby and I have been married thus far. I have become much more financially responsible. I have become braver in using my voice, in using my experiences and my skills. I have moved away from sources of security because they were not working for us. Libby was the one who started deconstructing her faith first. And it took me about a year after she started deconstructing to finally get to a point where I'm like, you know what, this really isn't working for me anymore. We have been through so much. And I am so fortunate to have my partner Libby, to have my friends, Ben, Katie and Brandon, and John and Dan, that I can grow with, I can learn from, I can support, and they can support me. And now we're on this brand new adventure with my dog Odin, who is constantly teaching us about essentially being a puppy parent every day and the responsibilities that entails. And we are learning, and we're growing, and we are expanding our horizons every day. We are learning what love is every day. We are learning what commitment is every day. We are learning about healthy, harmonious passions. We're learning about self-care. We are learning about boundaries. We're learning about faith. We're learning about politics. We're learning about everything that life has to throw at us. We're learning about grief, and we're going through it all together. And it has been a wild ride of 40 years for me. And in a lot of ways, this has really only touched the surface. It's hard to boil down 40 years of existence and experiences and memories in 4 episodes that at this point is less than an hour an episode. And I am really excited to see what the future has in store. I am excited to get back into a lot of these pursuits that I have just given up on because that's my go-to. I want to get back into my writing. I want to get back into my art. Libby and I, we want to visit Japan. We want to visit Scotland and Ireland. We would love to visit Australia if we could go to a place that doesn't have the gigantic spiders that would honestly scare the shit out of both of us. We want to travel. We want to build these relationships. And we want to continue to grow and learn together. And that's it for my story so far. It has been about 4 years now that I started working as a coach. It's been 3 years since I stepped away from a stable and good paying job in order to sit here at this computer and meet with people online and record podcasts and help people become the heroes of their own stories. I have had a lot to work through in becoming the hero of my own story. And it is a process of every day stepping into that. What it is to be a hero. What it is to respect and honor my gifts and use them instead of hiding them away. What it means to remove my mask and be myself instead of be what other people have expected me to be. It has been a process of liberating myself from the chains of my past in order to be free to spread my wings and fly into my future. And I hope that my story has been an inspiration to you. And if you would like some help in becoming the hero of your own story, then let's get that conversation started. You can set up a free call with me through my website, or there's just a link in the description where you can just set up a free call and we can talk about what it's going to be like for you to be the hero of your own story and how I can possibly help and whether we'd be a good fit. Next week we will do another hero study, and from here we'll just start to get more and more real. And I'm looking forward to speaking with you again. And until next time, live strong for today.